Investigators seek a serial bomber whose targets crisscross New York State. 4 deadly explosions in 90 minutes leave only vague clues to the bomber's identity. Detectives in Florida rush to the scene of a massive explosion at a lavish estate. Somewhere in the twisted wreckage lie clues that will lead them to the killer. Bomb investigators must piece together the shattered remains of an intricate puzzle. Every long and grueling bombing investigation begins with a short fuse. Eleanor Fowler of West Valley, New York, had no idea the phone call she received a few days after Christmas in 1993 would be a prelude to death. A delivery service asked for directions to her house so they could deliver a package. Suspicious, Eleanor called the police. They told her anonymous packages aren't a crime, and there was nothing they could do. Eleanor accepted the box with reluctance. She cut into it and removed the crumpled newspaper. Inside, she found a toolbox. Whoever sent it didn't include a note. She flipped the latch and lifted the lid, triggering a fatal explosion. Eleanor Fowler was the first victim in what was to become a statewide serial bombing. 5 more bombs, concealed inside identical toolboxes, were delivered throughout northern and western New York within 90 minutes. 4 of the bombs exploded, killing 5 and injuring 2. Investigators from 3 New York offices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, along with their national response team, followed the trail of explosions to each bomb site. The ATF is the federal agency assigned to investigate bombings. Special Agent Scott Samus of the Rochester Bureau of the ATF was one of the first agents to respond.
The investigation starts on December 28th, 1993, when I receive a phone call from my supervisor, who tells me to respond to Buffalo. He's had several bombings, possibly several deaths. Please come out there and assist. I'm in Rochester. I'm an hour and a half away. He then calls me back a few minutes later and asks me to stay in Rochester because there's just been a detonation in Rochester with possibly some deaths there.
The 4 simultaneous bombings would stretch the limits of the ATF and other law enforcement agencies. At each scene, investigators' first task was to find every piece of evidence, no matter how small, no matter how inconsequential it looked. It was too soon to tell what might point them to the person who sent the deadly packages. Much of the evidence consisted of small fragments coated with explosive residue. To determine what kind of explosive was used, the evidence at each scene was bagged and sent to forensic chemist Doug Klapek. at the ATF laboratories in Rockville, Maryland.
Well, in this case, we had to make sure that everything not only was stored separately up in Rochester, but was shipped separately down here. And different people were handling different parts of evidence. Even though things were already in airtight containers, we wanted to make sure that was the case.
As the lab processed the evidence, investigators tried to trace the packages. The bomber used local delivery services and the U.S. mail, making the parcels difficult to trace. Unaware of their deadly cargo, the unsuspecting drivers made their rounds. The packages, weighing about 16 pounds, looked harmless enough. How could the delivery people know they were laden with death? Not all the bombs reached their targets. When one driver tried to deliver a package to Corrections Officer Scott Kemp at the New York State Penitentiary, he learned Kemp wasn't working. The penitentiary couldn't accept the package. Aggravated at the delay it would cause him to redeliver it another time, he threw the box into the back of his van. Through sheer luck, the bomb didn't detonate. This bomb and another that malfunctioned were disarmed by the Erie County Sheriff's Bomb Squad. They provided investigators with an important break in the case. They now could look at how the bombs were built.
Inside this device, after is tripped by opening it up, this would trip the device. Not doing the latch, but opening it up like this would trip the device, like that. That would cause the detonator to explode inside here and hit this about 4 pounds of dynamite. Also included inside of this device was about 11.5 pounds of shrapnel. And these shrapnel pieces were of 28 different varieties.
Propelled by the dynamite, each piece of shrapnel travels 10 times faster than a bullet. Moving at 14 to 15,000 feet per second, the shards can tear through solid concrete. Explosives are grouped in two categories: high explosives and low explosives. High explosives like dynamite and C4 are the most powerful. They are used commercially for demolition and excavation and for military applications. Very stable to work with, high explosives require a great amount of force, a detonator, to set them off. Low explosives include the flash powder used in firecrackers and smokeless powder used in shotgun shells. They're easier to ignite than high explosives and are the explosive of choice for amateur bombers. By looking at the degree of destruction at the New York bomb scenes, investigators knew immediately that it was caused by high explosives. James Crippen, a 9-year veteran with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, trains law enforcement agencies to conduct bomb investigations at the scene and in the lab. He's seen his share of the havoc wrought by high explosives.
Certainly a pound of C4 is going to do a whole lot more damage than a pound of black powder. You know, a pound of black powder, you know, make a pretty good bomb, but you know, a pound of C4 will, you know, can devastate a building. I mean, you're talking a difference in detonation velocity of anywhere from 1,200 to maybe 1,800 feet per second for black powder to in the neighborhood of 25,000 feet per second for C4. So there's a lot more force involved, a lot more shattering force.
But sometimes people can survive a bomb blast, even from a high explosive. Roosevelt Town resident William Lazore was a target of the New York serial bomber, but his suspicion saved his life. When Lazore picked up his package from the post office, the clerk joked that it might be a bomb. Though the clerk was trying to be funny, Lazor was careful enough to open the toolbox with his rake. That added bit of distance and caution saved his life when the bomb exploded. Several hundred miles away in Cheektowaga, Robert Fowler was less fortunate. Eleanor Fowler's husband received his package at work. These pictures were taken from a surveillance camera that captures a still image every few seconds. They count down the final moments in the lives of Robert Fowler and his co-worker, John O'Donnell. Just before the explosion, another co-worker, Jeffrey Camp, offered to open the package with his pocket knife. The blast was so powerful, it threw Fowler some 15 feet down the hallway. Miraculously, Camp survived and can be seen fleeing the scene for help. 6 bombs, 4 explosions, 4 counties in New York State. Each unexploded bomb was nearly identical, packaged in a toolbox and mailed from Buffalo. The bombing shared another element. All the intended victims were related.
All the family members are interviewed. There were other family members who were not targeted, who were found and interviewed, and who survived. And everyone was asked, who do you think might have done this? And everybody said, well, Mike Stevens, maybe he did it.
56-year-old Mike Stevens had a girlfriend named Brenda Shavir. Everyone targeted in the bombing was related to Brenda. The connection might have been a coincidence, except for one more revealing detail. 3 months earlier, the Monroe County Sheriff's bomb squad told Sammis that a restaurant manager near Rochester found more than 100 sticks of dynamite near a dumpster. The code numbers on the dynamite matched the dynamite in the unexploded bombs. Investigators traced the numbers to the Kentucky Powder Company. The firm, housed in a quarry, sold blasting supplies. Employees gave Sammis a description of a man who had purchased 55 pounds of dynamite and 50 blasting caps 4 months earlier. Sammis's investigation revealed this man to be Earl Figley, a close friend of Mike Stevens. Sammis questioned Figley. Presented with all the evidence implicating him, Figley confessed that he and Stevens made the bombs and sent them to Brenda's family. Figley explained Stevens' motivation. Mike wanted to exact revenge on his girlfriend's family for not accepting him.
The relationship between the two started becoming strained, and Mike started tapping her phone calls. And just as in any relationship, your own family is going to support you in your relationship with another person. And that's what happened in this case. Things weren't going well. Family members of Brenda would tell her, if it's not working out, why don't you get out of the relationship?
Police had enough evidence to arrest both Earl Figley and Mike Stevens, but they still had to build a case that could not be beaten in court. For that, they needed hard evidence to convict Mike Stevens. In New York in 1994, detectives continued to follow every lead as they built their case against a serial bomber. While Mike Stevens and Earl Figley were in jail, the ATF National Response Team searched Figley's hotel room. They found boxes identical to the ones used to send the bombs. A tip led ATF agents and the Rochester Police Bomb Squad to a cache of evidence in a storage locker Stevens had rented several months earlier.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Inside the locker, police uncovered dynamite and blasting caps. The explosives provided the ATF and other agencies with the ammunition they needed in their case against Stevens. But the incriminating evidence didn't stop with the explosives.
Disguise that Earl Figley wore.
They also recovered disguises Figley wore when he purchased equipment and mailed the bombs: a wig, beard, and theatrical makeup.
And a beard and a mustache.
They also found the books Stevens and Figley studied to learn how to construct the deadly weapons. The fact that these books exist represents the risk we take living in a free society, according to bomb expert James Crippen.
The information has always been around on how to build devices. That's one of the things that we live with in the United States, because we have a very rigid view of freedom of information, no matter how much trouble it's going to cause us down the road. And I certainly agree with that point of view that, you don't want to restrict information. You just hope that people will use it responsibly.
Besides the explosives and books found in storage, investigators also found tools in Stevens' home. And like most everything else used in a crime, tools can be traced. At the ATF laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, forensic investigators carefully studied wire cutters they found in Stevens' home. Tool mark specialists had to match the wire cutters with the marks they made on the wires found in all the bombs. Tool mark examiner Elizabeth Gillis.
When you have two tools that come off the production line one after the other, they're each going to have their own individuality, their own individual marks, so that when you do make a test cut with the tools, you can put them on the microscope and be able to differentiate between which tool made which mark.
First, Gillis cuts a piece of wire using the cutter she wants to test. The wire is the same type found in the evidence. Investigators must make dozens of cuts with the tool in order to study the angle, contact area, and other attributes of the cut. Only then can they match a wire with the tool that cut it. She places the test cut under a microscope, orienting it to the appropriate angle so that she can compare the test cut with the wire found in evidence. She then superimposes the two images to see if the two cut patterns match. In the case of Mike Stevens, investigators made a successful match. The wires used in all the bombs had been cut by the wire cutters found in the basement of Stevens' house. While the books, wires, and tools helped investigators tighten their grip on Mike Stevens, they still wanted one more piece of evidence. They needed to establish a connection between the explosives and the suspect.
People think that when a bomb goes off and blows up, that everything goes away. There's nothing further from the truth. When you have an explosion, all the explosive material is converted into a gaseous state that actually is consumed in the explosion. Well, that will go out as a heated gas, and when it hits other objects, it will cool down and start coating those objects, such as metal or clothing or wood or whatever. So not only will you have unreacted particles of explosives, but you'll have this gaseous film that's developed on other objects that you can test and get the residues from.
At the ATF lab in Rockville, Maryland, Doug Klapek analyzed residue from the bomb scene to determine the kind of explosive used. Once identified, Klapek tried to match it with evidence collected from Mike Stevens. The residue from explosives evaporates quickly, so samples of the debris were packed in airtight canisters. To test for explosive residue, Klapek had to capture it as it dissipated. He prepared a charcoal-filled pipette, which he then inserted into the top of the canister. The apparatus was then attached to a vacuum. As the canister was gently heated, air was drawn out through the pipette. The charcoal inside the pipette grabbed the chemical components from the evidence. These chemicals were analyzed to see what explosive they came from. The test confirmed that dynamite was the explosive used in these bombs. Next, Klapek had to prove that Stevens and Figley had recently handled dynamite. If they had, its residue would have remained on their clothes.
I found off of Stevens' boots and his clothes ethylene glycol dinitrate, which is only found in dynamite. There's no commercial use other than in dynamite for this material.
Investigators had made their case. They had matched Stevens and Figley to explosives and the tools used to make the bombs. Any missing details were sewn together by Earl Figley himself. With this evidence, ATF agents determined that Mike Stevens constructed 6 bombs in the Rochester hotel room with the help of Earl Figley. In fact, to shift blame from himself, Stevens made sure Figley played a significant role in the murders.
Mike Stevens was using Earl to do all his dirty work for him. And he was successful, I guess, for a few hours anyway, but not for very long.
Stevens' motive was vengeance. He was determined to make Brenda Shavir's family pay for rejecting him. To be certain the bombs were fatal, he loaded each with shrapnel.
There is no doubt in my mind that these devices were designed to kill somebody upon opening. They're a strictly booby-trap device addressed to a specific person.
In order to make the bombs harder to trace, Stevens stuffed the packages with newspapers from Buffalo, so it would appear the packages were sent from there, not from his home in Rochester. In court, Figley implicated Mike Stevens, then pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Convicted of the deaths of 5 people, Stevens was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. Most times, when a bomb detonates, it begins an agonizing catastrophe. But in a small town in Georgia, explosions are an everyday occurrence. Worldwide, the number of bombings is increasing every year. An alcohol, tobacco, and firearms study revealed that from 1990 to 1994, the number of reported bombings nearly doubled in the United States alone. Pete Maston, head of ATF training, has investigated explosions for more than 30 years.
Well, the typical bomber is perhaps the ultimate coward. The typical bomber doesn't face, nor do they want to face their opponent. They would much prefer to use whatever subterfuge and cover they can.
To make sure these criminals are brought to justice, the ATF brings young investigators and students to this testing ground in Brunswick, Georgia, to teach them how to catch a bomber. Here, the ATF trains evidence technicians, fire investigators, schematic artists, and explosives technicians. At the academy, each skill is refined by repetition. On this day, ATF bomb scene instructors will test their students' knowledge by detonating 3 car bombs, simulating real crime scenes. The men building and packaging these explosives are highly trained experts. Their job is as delicate as it is dangerous. One cannot underestimate the power of the explosive materials. That's why, in inexperienced hands, bomb-making information can be a recipe for disaster, as instructor Larry Casey explains.
All that information that's available doesn't have proper safety precautions in it, and the learning skills of sequential assembly processes, things that are important to know for safety reasons, are totally missing there. So they're always at great risk to blow themselves up. And we oftentimes will get a call and you'll find the tragic aftermath in a garage or someplace where the kids were doing experimentation, and what you get are pieces of bodies and tools scattered around and death and destruction, and that's the sad part of this.
Instructors at the academy begin the training session by building pipe bombs. These bombs are not mock-ups, they are real. The explosive powder must be filled with great care. Just a few grains stuck in the pipe thread could trigger a blast. A small spark or even static electricity could ignite the powder. For the test, the bomb is placed so the end caps shoot into the engine compartment and the back seat, making the work of finding them more of a challenge for the students.
So that big high-pressure end cap should go right into that radio area.
So it's fore and aft kind of at this angle?
Yeah.
Okay.
When everyone has cleared the area, it's time for detonation. After the explosion, ATF investigators inspect the wreckage. Some of the lighter fragments were propelled hundreds of feet into the woods, creating a huge area to investigate. These fragments provide the students with valuable clues about the makeup of the bomb and where it was placed inside the car. In the field, nothing can be overlooked. Investigators have only one chance to gather evidence.
Once the scene is released, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to come back into that scene or to recreate that scene hours, days, or weeks later. So it's a one-shot opportunity for perfection.
It quickly becomes evident how destructive these small pipe bombs can be. This explosion was so powerful that part of the cardboard carton pierced the car's steel door.
It's difficult to tell.
Smaller holes.
Other fragments sliced through the roof as if it were foil.
These holes are larger because the pieces didn't fragment as much.
Instructors prepare the next bomb by mixing several low explosives into one powerful cocktail. The work is nerve-wracking. The powder must be tamped into the pipe and the detonator delicately taped to the loaded bomb. In some cases, the seat cushions are wetted down to prevent fire from destroying evidence the students will need to work with. The final package is ready to detonate. After the explosions, the students divide into teams. The team leader assigns each person to a task.
Charlie, Ray, Rick, Frank, Joe. And Colin's going to kind of be the overseer of that group. What you found, if you feel like you found something that's a really critical piece of evidence that's going to give us, particularly the guys that are on the car, to give them an idea on what the device is, to help them look more deeply into certain things, let's bring that up.
The students work together to investigate the bomb scene. In the field, ATF agents have to work quickly and under a great deal of pressure. Students are taught early on they will have to work with state and local authorities, laboratory technicians, and most importantly, each other to solve a crime. One team begins its work by forming a perimeter around the scene. Then they divide the area into quadrants before they begin their search for fragments.
Hey, Jim?
Just let him.
Colin.
Here's your, this looks like the piece of the end cap, right?
The students walk along the tarmac, advancing as a team so they don't miss any shard of evidence. Each piece is then identified with a chalk circle or a small orange cone and assigned a number. In an explosive scene like this, evidence numbers can reach into the thousands. One team member records the identification number and exact location of each piece of evidence. Distances between the fragments are measured to plot their location. Another team closely inspects the damage inside the car. Their job is to figure out which fragments are part of the car and which may be parts of the bomb. For many of the students, this is the first time they have seen a bomb's devastation up close. It won't be their last. And while the damage to the car looks complete, valuable evidence remains embedded in the wreckage. Hatchets, hammers, and crowbars are brought in to pull these clues from the vehicle. The car is literally dissected as students search for pieces of the bomb lodged in or behind the dashboard. They never know where they might find the most significant piece of evidence. The students then move the car and search underneath. Bombs explode in all directions, and clues typically become embedded in the asphalt. Inspectors then sweep up what remains of the scene. The debris is then carefully sifted through a thin wire screen to separate any small clues that may have been overlooked. Instructors intensify the pressure and pump up the realism by adding a chaotic element to the bomb scene. They're called survivors. Role players portray panicked victims and family members whose loved ones have been killed or injured in the blast. The scenarios are built on actual occurrences. The students must learn to be firm but compassionate in the emotionally charged atmosphere. As the actors rush toward the bombed-out car, they're stopped by students who must be able to comfort them and keep them clear of the investigation. Once the scene is cleared, it is photographed and videotaped. Fragments are then collected and sent to a lab. These thorough investigation methods must be learned if the students ever hope to catch a bomber.
You've got to be able to prove your investigation in a court of law. And most of the time, that takes forensic evidence that puts the bomb in the hands of the bomber.
In the classroom, they get an anatomy lesson. learning the vital parts of a bomb. Tape, pipe, detonator, and wires are all carefully examined as the students begin to piece together the evidence gathered outside at the bombing scene. The need for well-trained ATF investigators is crucial for crime solving. Usually, when a bomb goes off, the bomber is miles away. But in a case in Florida, he struck frighteningly close to home. On July 9, 1985, two deafening explosions, seconds apart, rocked a quiet suburban neighborhood in Naples, Florida. The Collier County Sheriff's deputies immediately arrived at the scene. But the explosion had already taken the lives of two people. Matron of the wealthy Benson and Hedges tobacco family, Margaret Benson, and her adopted son Scott were killed. Margaret's daughter, Carol Lynn, was critically injured. The sheriff's office knew this type of devastation was no accident. They called the ATF for help. Special Agent Ralph Ostrowski worked the investigation.
In my 22 years with ATF, particularly my time in Cleveland, when I worked a lot of organized crime, bombings, vehicle bombings, this was without a doubt the worst vehicle bombing I had ever seen.
Ostrowski and his team immediately set out to discover what caused the destruction. Debris from the exploded Chevy Suburban was spread for yards around.
Oftentimes, especially in a bombing of this magnitude, debris can be spread hundreds of feet well beyond what you think it would be.
ATF agents worked with police to establish a procedure to conduct the evidence gathering. The agents had done this many times before, and they knew this case was going to take a lot of time to solve.
So by the second or third day, needless to say, the scene got to be very, very tedious to work. The agents were forced to wear masks because of the stench, and they did an excellent job in recovering as much of the evidence as they did recover.
Every fragment was marked. Chalk outlined where pieces of debris landed after the explosion. It didn't take long to discover the probable cause of the explosion. They found pieces of large metal pipes that weren't automobile parts. The ATF was confident the vehicle was destroyed by a powerful pipe bomb, but they now had to determine how it was constructed and who planted it.
The vehicle was absolutely destroyed. This was a large vehicle, a 1978 Chevy Suburban. The top of it was peeled back with two 27-pound pipe bombs in a contained vehicle. The force of the explosion did a great deal of damage.
B6.
As the evidence continued to accumulate, agents began questioning witnesses.
Like I said, I went ahead and...
The first person they spoke with was Stephen Benson, the only family member to escape injury.
Escorted them in the car.
His mother and his brother had been killed. His sister was fighting for her life in a hospital, yet police reported that Stephen Benson's demeanor was perfectly calm, even upbeat. This raised the suspicions of Collier County Captain Tom Storer.
My suspicions were aroused immediately that something is not right in what was going on. It just wasn't consistent with a catastrophic event that had just occurred.
Within 24 hours of the explosion, Stephen Benson stopped talking directly with police. All questions filtered through his attorney. Though suspicious about Stephen Benson, investigators had to be careful not to jump to conclusions. So far, they had no solid evidence for or against Benson's involvement. It was too early in the game to launch accusations, and they had no time to waste following a false trail.
Okay, we'll be in touch with you. Okay, thank you.
We follow the evidence wherever that evidence is going to take us. If we focus on one subject and use all of our resources on that one subject and we happen to be wrong, then we've wasted very valuable time early on in the investigation when it's probably one of the most critical periods.
Back at the sheriff's office, investigators began to study all the evidence from the scene, including pieces of electronic circuitry and batteries, elements of a trigger device. They knew that whoever planted the bomb had some expertise in assembling electronics. Ralph Ostrowski and Jack Gant began to study a schematic artist's map of the explosion, giving them a clear look at the epicenter and direction of the blast.
The purpose of these sketches that we're looking at here today is to assist the investigator when he testifies in court. He'll be asked by the defense where each piece of these articles were picked up, and he must be able to testify that he picked these articles up in a location around the car. He must be able to provide testimony of what this article is. He must be able to tell the date and time he got it and identify it later, that this is the item that he picked up the particular day of the crime. Without that testimony, this evidence cannot be used in court.
The schematic shows where every speck of evidence was found after the blast. Their small size and great distance from the car are testament to the tremendous power of the explosion as it tore through the vehicle. Once the maps were drawn and the evidence was collected, the investigation moved north. Fragments gathered at the scene were taken to the ATF laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia. Here, investigators would try to make sense of the twisted wreckage of the vehicle. Forensic chemist Walter Mitchell, a 26-year veteran of the ATF, started with a visual inspection of the fragments. Through the microscope, Mitchell studied the small wafer-like specks clinging to the sample. He tentatively identified the particles as smokeless powder. To confirm he was dealing with smokeless powder, Mitchell had to test it chemically using a process called thin layer chromatography. First, he coated a sheet of glass with an absorbent layer. Then he placed dots of the smokeless powder and his unknown sample on it. The glass was dipped into a tank of solvent. As the solvent was drawn up the absorbent layer, it carried with it small quantities of the dissolved powders. If the powders were the same, they'd migrate the same distance up the glass, forming streaks of identical length and color. Mitchell removed and dried it. Then he put the glass under ultraviolet light to compare the colors of the streaks. In this case, the color of the smokeless powder and the unknown sample matched. A comparison of the lengths of the streaks matched too. The test confirmed Mitchell's suspicions. Smokeless powder was used to blow up the vehicle in Naples, Florida. But scientists in the laboratory could not find any way to link the bomber to the bomb fragments. That evidence would have to come from somewhere else. In Naples, Florida, forensic investigators began to track down the origin of the metal pipe they believed housed the bombs that killed the Bensons. Pipe manufacturers stamp a maker's mark on their products. Fortunately, enough of the logo survived the blast to be identified. Agents traced the pipes to the only company in town that sold that brand. A store employee told investigators that a few days earlier he had sold the pipes to a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The buyer said he worked for the Del Rey Construction Company. Investigators later found out that no such company existed. They took the invoices as evidence. The signatures were nothing more than a scribble, but the paper contained something more revealing. The invoices bore the impressions of a palm print. Could they be the link to the suspect, Stephen Benson? Authorities obtained Benson's own palm prints for comparison. They hoped to find enough points of identification between the two to make a match.
In this case, these palm prints that did come up on these forms are in excellent condition, and the points of identification probably reached near 60 to 75 points of ID. There's no question in anybody's mind that these palm prints are those of Stephen Benson. We have an item we'd like to show you that we...
A background check on Stephen Benson uncovered his fascination with explosives. In a high school yearbook, a dedication he wrote to an old girlfriend read, "I hope to see you this summer, then we can bomb around."
We had developed information that he started experimenting with explosives back many years ago in Pennsylvania. We had talked to witnesses that saw him with firecracker, M80, M100 type of devices, using copper tubing, using remote control to set off some of these firecrackers.
To understand Benson's possible motivation for murder, authorities looked to a financial auditor. The auditor determined that Benson, despite his access to a family fortune, was a terrible businessman. Police discovered that his financial failures were so far-ranging that Stephen started forging checks from his mother's accounts. When Margaret Benson discovered this, she threatened to write Stephen out of her will. Could it be Stephen Benson saw one clear way to get at those millions? Investigators believe Benson used his expertise in electronics to construct the two deadly bombs and the trigger device he used to set them off. On the morning of the bombing, Stephen told everyone he was going to pick up coffee and donuts. But police believe this is when he planted the bombs in the car. Once that was done, all he had to do was trigger the bombs, and a family fortune would be his. Or at least, that's what he planned. After Stephen placed the bombs under the car, he drove back home. He was gone approximately 45 minutes. Carol Lynn, Margaret, Scott, and Stephen set out to drive to the Gulf Coast to survey property for a new house. Carol Lynn reported that Stephen calmly walked side by side with the group, giving no indication of the tragedy he knew he was about to ignite. But as they were all about to get into the car, Carol Lynn noticed something was wrong.
Carol Lynn was able to tell us that the morning they got into the vehicle to leave, that things didn't look right at that point. She noticed that Scott was the driver. That was very rare that Scott was ever the driver. She noticed that Mother was in the front seat. Mother was seldom in the front seat, and that was her place because she got car sick a lot.
According to his plan, Stephen made sure everyone got into the car. Just before they were about to leave, Stephen excused himself to pick up something he'd forgotten. he disappeared inside the house. The investigation into the bombings uncovered the evidence needed to arrest and convict Stephen Benson. He was sentenced to life in prison. Bombs are built from common materials by people with an uncommon thirst for vengeance. Easily concealed, utterly devastating, a bomb can detonate anytime, anywhere. It's this simple truth that makes bombing so challenging to investigators and so chilling for the rest of us. But investigators have the advantage. When a bomber does strike, he always leaves his weapon at the scene of the crime. And with it is the residue of his guilt. Investigators race to stop a serial bomber who sends his deadly parcels by mail. 3 people have been killed, and no one knows how many more packages are en route to their targets. In California, experts match wits with a terrorist bent on crippling the Internal Revenue Service. For 5 years, his bombs have confounded authorities. Sheer luck has prevented injuries, but sheer skill is what's needed to catch him. Beneath the rubble, the terrorist leaves a calling card that experts are learning to read. In bomb investigations, forensics means the difference between feeling safe and living in terror. Fear is the terrorist's greatest ally. To achieve his ends, he doesn't care who dies. He can strike anywhere, anytime. And though his crimes are carefully plotted, their effect seems horribly random. When bombs are his weapon of choice, he can kill from a distance. In Birmingham, Alabama, 2 weeks before Christmas 1989, Helen Vance accepted a package addressed to her husband, Robert. Federal Judge Robert Vance came in from his yard work to find the package on the table where his wife was wrapping gifts. Believing it contained magazines he'd been waiting for, he cut the string and opened the box. He was killed instantly. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they tried to help Helen Vance, who was standing nearby when the bomb exploded. She was temporarily deafened from the blast and in shock, unable to speak. Forensic experts rushed to the scene to investigate. They collected nails embedded in the walls and ceiling, shards of steel pipe, and the remnants of the package itself. The explosion had hurled the shrapnel up to 3,600 miles per hour. Each fragment was carefully cataloged. Only the most meticulous work would allow authorities to catch a killer who struck from a distance. And that killer wasn't stopping. 150 miles away in Atlanta, 2 days after Judge Vance was killed, a package arrived at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, addressed to the clerk's office. A routine X-ray revealed the ominous silhouette of a pipe bomb. Before the shocked security officers could stop it, the package dropped to the floor. The officers immediately evacuated the building and called bomb technicians. An alert posted after the death of Judge Vance described the device that killed him. The Atlanta bomb resembled the one in Birmingham. Though Vance's bomb was rigged to explode when the package was opened, the bomb techs had to assume this one could blow at any moment. The drop from the conveyor belt and routine handling in the post office could have rendered it unstable. Their Kevlar suits, 3 inches thick and weighing 80 pounds, provide safety only at a distance. If the tech is close to the detonation, the pressure from the blast would crush him. The first step was to photograph and X-ray the bomb to study its components. The X-rays revealed no timing device, so the techs breathed a little easier.
I think the switch is going to be all right. We know the bomb.
There was no reason to rush. Unless a bomb is rigged to a timer or strapped to a victim, bomb removal typically takes hours. Every step was planned, every motion rehearsed. As each maneuver was carefully completed, the bomb techs paused to ventilate their smothering suits and modify their strategy. As a precaution, the area around the building was kept clear of pedestrians and traffic. Throughout the delicate operation, their hands remained uncovered to assure they kept a secure grip. Once they were certain the bomb was stable, they lowered it into a bin and put it in an armored trailer. Police cars and motorcycles cleared a safe area around the vehicle. The convoy took the least populated route to the bomb range at the city landfill. The package was rendered safe, but this second bomb in 2 days had enormous impact. It suggested a serial bomber. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms Special Agent Brian Hoback was assigned to the case.
You got to remember who the targets were. 1, a judge, a federal judge. 2, people at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals who had nothing to do with the judicial system other than administrative matters.
But the bomber wasn't through. On December 18th, the same day the Atlanta bomb was deactivated, attorney Robbie Robinson received a package in Savannah, 250 miles away. Like Judge Vance, Robinson had no reason to suspect anything sinister about the package sitting on his desk a week before Christmas. In an instant, he became the killer's second victim. Investigators mapped out the direction of the explosion to better estimate the size of the bomb. They set up a grid and began the tedious task of collecting even the tiniest shreds of evidence.
When investigators go to a crime scene, they're looking for physical evidence. That evidence in a bombing scene is everywhere. It's on the ceilings, it's on the ground, it's in the walls, it's in the furniture, it's in the victim's body, it's on the victim's clothing. First, we photograph. Then we grid the room so that we know exactly where that piece of evidence came from, and we can articulate that to a jury. We got down on our hands and knees and collected that evidence, sifted it, stick it over a screen, shake the debris to see if we can't find components of whatever the device was that exploded. In that particular case, it was a pipe bomb inside of a cardboard box.
One of the more insidious aspects of the bomb was the fact that dozens of nails, seen here in X-rays of the victim's body, were packed around the pipe, increasing the deadliness of the explosion. These nails matched those from Judge Vance's bomb and the package intercepted at the courthouse in Atlanta. The wrapping, found almost intact in Robinson's trash can, was also comparable to the other bombs. With 3 bombs in 2 days, time was precious. Agent Hoback and his multi-agency team struggled to find a link between the 3 targets. Why would someone single out this particular lawyer, judge, and court building? The bombing seemed like random strikes against the legal system. If that were true, the bomber would be hard to predict and harder to catch. They couldn't anticipate who the next victim might be, and it was likely that the bomb was already in the mail.
His shot is peeled backwards on that.
In the lab, experts studied the nails, pieces of pipe, bits of wire, and package remnants collected from the exploded bombs. They took inventory of the most minute details. Barely perceptible markings, fragments of logos, tiny pieces of packaging, all may lead to manufacturers or retail outlets or directly to a killer. But in this case, the items surviving the blast were too generic to tell them anything. The bomber continued with his deadly plan. Fortunately, Jacksonville, Florida NAACP President Willie Dennis was too busy to open her mail on December 18th. Learning of Robinson's death in Savannah and warned by her friends to be wary of any packages, she called her secretary the next day to advise him not to open the parcel on her desk.
What she later did was call the sheriff's department down there in Jacksonville and requested them to look at a package that to her seemed somewhat suspicious.
The technicians noted it was identical to packages used in the previous bombings. They photographed and x-rayed it to see if their suspicions were justified.
You got a power supply, you got wires going into an unknown gun substance.
The x-rays disclosed a device that matched the other bombs, so investigators had the advantage of knowing what they were dealing with.
First thing we're going to do is disrupt.
The technicians used a mechanical device to disable its firing system. The package had been successfully ripped apart. Still wary of an explosion, technicians carefully pulled the unexploded pipe bomb from the office while maintaining a cautious distance. It was brought to a bomb range, studied, rendered safe, and carefully dismantled. Left behind in the office were the now familiar nails and brown paper with red and white mailing labels. Like most mail bombers, This one affixed more than enough postage to assure his package was delivered. This parcel also contained something surprising, a roll of hate mail. It included a copy of a threatening letter sent to a Jacksonville television station. The postmark linked it to an Atlanta post office. So now the agents knew the bomb was probably sent from Georgia. The physical evidence was building. These strongly worded letters put right-wing fringe groups high on the list of suspects. The ATF assembled a task force to outsmart the bomber. Terry Pelfrey, a bomb technician with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was called into the group's monthly lunch meeting.
My role in the investigation was to first look at right-wing groups that were located in Georgia. These included the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation members, Christian Identity Church Movement members, and skinheads. We had informants in each of these groups. Some of the informants ranked as high as Grand Dragons in these groups, which were the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. There was no talk within the right-wing movement groups that would give us any indication of bomb suspects in these groups.
At the December 19th meeting, an ATF agent outlined the similarities among the recent bombing incidents.
After considerable effort, if you see anything you recognize.
He passed around pictures of the bomb recovered at the courthouse and described what he knew of its construction.
The device consists of a pipe bomb with flat welded end plates.
The description struck a spark of recognition for ATF bomb expert Lloyd Irwin. The bombs resembled one he saw in 1972. Though he had inspected more than 3,000 bombs in his career, he had a feeling this was the work of the same bomber.
The minute I looked at it, I saw some characteristics of this bomb that reminded me of the 1972 bomb. That being that it had square end plates held with a bolt through the center. I only had one bolt, but still it was the same technique.
How about drawing me a picture?
He hadn't seen another like it in more than 15 years. From memory, Irwin sketched the 1972 bomb.
You learn that the guy, even though he changes his technique, if he's made them before, he'll keep something similar because he knows it worked before. Why trash it when he can make it work again? So he might modify it, but he'll still have some similarities of something that he's done before.
Did we get him?
Yeah.
For Irwin, the construction of the devices bore the signature of the 1972 bomber. Right after the meeting, he called Special Agent Hoback.
So Lloyd Irwin called me back at the office to advise me that he had seen only one other device like this in all the years that he had been involved in these types of investigations, and he gave me the name of the man who had been convicted of possessing that device in 1972. That man's name was Walter Leroy Moody.
Roy Moody had been convicted of building a bomb he intended to send to the man who had repossessed his car. The bomb's real victim, however, was Moody's wife, Hazel, who inadvertently opened the package, injuring her hand and eye and severely burning her face. Roy Moody went to prison, and Hazel was granted a divorce. The ATF began taking a closer look at Roy Moody.
We eliminate suspects by different things. Motive might be one way to eliminate them, whether their presence was actually in the area. There's a number of ways to eliminate suspects. However, what we were doing with other suspects by eliminating them, we could not do with Walter Leroy Moody.
At this point, most of the evidence linking Moody to the bombings was circumstantial. The investigators now had to positively link the components of the bombs to the suspected bomber. For that, they relied on the ATF Forensics Lab in Atlanta. By analyzing the chemical composition of the detonators and primers, experts determined who manufactured them. Fortunately, the company had very limited distribution in the Southeast. The manufacturer provided a list of the stores that sold their product. Meanwhile, the ATF noted further similarities between Moody's 1972 bomb and the recent ones. All used cardboard boxes, metal pipes with square end caps and a rod, flashlight batteries, and flashlight bulbs. So investigators would have more first-hand information. Specialists recreated and detonated the bombs. When powder packed inside a sealed pipe is ignited, it quickly converts from solid to gas. The resulting pressure is enormous. In an instant, the pipe bursts, sending razor-sharp fragments of steel and nails in all directions at deadly speed. Whoever built these bombs went to great lengths to maximize their destructive power. They were made for only one purpose: to kill. A behavioral profile described the killer as a white male, working and living alone or with one other person, disciplined, educated, self-structured, meticulous, and cowardly. He believed his current job was beneath him. Presented with that profile, Terry Pelfrey recognized the precise description of the man he had been investigating, Roy Moody.
Bill Hagmeyer with the FBI did the psychological profiling. He did not know Walter Leroy Moody at all. And so I sat during the meetings with Mr. Hagmeyer. He read the psychological profile that he had written up, and he wrote Mr. Moody's life story in that profile. It was really rather scary.
The weight of the combined evidence was enough to obtain a search warrant. On February 8th, investigators searched Moody's house. They uncovered law books and transcripts of Moody's 1972 bomb trial.
As we found in his transcripts during this search warrant, the highlighted areas where we matched forensically the evidence from the explosive site to the evidence that was found within his home and his workshop. All that matched in 1972, so in 1989, Mr. Moody gets smarter. He thinks he gets smarter.
But it was the clues detectives failed to find that raised their suspicions further.
We knew that Mr. Moody kept his books from school because he had his law books. However, he didn't have his chemistry books. We also did not find the weapons that apparently Mr. Moody owned. We knew he owned some because he had ammunition in the front seat of his pickup truck. So where were those weapons?
Following a lead, investigators secured permission to search the basement of a house in Chamblee, Georgia, where Moody rented storage space. They found a pipe with caps screwed onto each end. The caps had holes drilled through them, and one of the ends had a nut welded atop it, ready for a rod to be threaded through.
Ask the owner, see if we can get a picture.
One of the investigators on the scene was ATF Special Agent David Heitch.
All ATF agents are trained in our basic school to identify improvised explosive devices, and the most basic and most commonly used improvised explosive device in this country is a pipe bomb. And so when you see a pipe nipple with end caps affixed, I automatically think that potentially we've got a pipe bomb.
Heitch took the pipe to chemist Lloyd Irwin, who suspected Roy Moody's handiwork early in the investigation. Irwin scraped the pipe in search of explosive residue. His analysis yielded only rust. The pipe may have been a prototype, but agents had no way to prove it. They just didn't have enough to make their case. In their search for more evidence in the mail bombings, investigators went to stores that sold the brand of primers used in the bombs. Their hunt led them to the Shootin' Iron gun shop in Griffin, Georgia. An employee remembered selling a 4-pound keg of Red Dot smokeless powder and 4,000 handgun primers in December of 1989. The large purchase stuck in his mind. Red Dot was the powder used in the December bombs, and 3,200 primers were needed to fire them. In a photo lineup, the clerk chose Roy Moody as the customer. Investigators felt they had their man. On July 10, 1990, Roy Moody was arrested and held without bail. Police also brought into custody his wife, Susan, as a possible accomplice. She was permitted a bond. Susan Moody was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy in exchange for her complete cooperation. She told investigators how she had been a servant to Roy almost since the day they met in 1981. She said Roy taught her to cover her trail, use disguises, buy materials, and mail packages far from home. She also offered the name of Roy's former cellmate. When investigators searched his house, they found footlockers with Moody's name on them. They contained the missing guns and chemistry books. Agents also found ammunition, a bomb diagram, and an arc welding unit. Susan Moody's testimony was crucial to cracking the case.
She pretty much put everything together for us. We had bits and pieces all throughout the investigation of why Moody did this, how he did this, to what extent he did the bombings the same way that he did in 1972 as far as their construction. However, Mrs. Moody actually told us how he went about the process and how the process began with the motive.
And what was that motive? Roy Moody had a history of frivolous litigation. Most of his cases were thrown out of court. He was desperate to become a lawyer so he could fix what he considered to be a flawed system. But he was denied the bar exam because of his 1972 felony conviction for creating the bomb that injured his first wife. When he failed to have the conviction overturned, Moody swore revenge against the judicial system. He started with Judge Robert Vance, who had written an opinion denying his appeal. Moody was caught through dedicated investigative work, detailed forensics, and the sharp memory of bomb investigator Lloyd Irwin.
We have a computer system at ATF that matches up bomb components, and it's a very valuable computer system, and we're continuously refining that computer system. It's amazing what it can do. You can enter the components you have from a device, and it will tell you if there have ever been any similar devices constructed. Well, in this particular case, Lloyd beat the computer, and there's no substitute for experience like Lloyd has.
The legal system that Roy Moody felt had failed him did not fail the citizens he terrorized. In June 1991, the jury sentenced him to 7 life terms plus 400 years, later changed to the death penalty. Moody's twisted agenda relied on the U.S. mail to deliver his bombs to specific people. But other terrorists are not so particular about who they murder. The Oklahoma City bombing was thought to be a strike against government. In the process of destroying the building, 168 citizens were killed. When a terrorist targets the government, there's no predicting how or when he'll attack. In the early morning hours of February 22, 1990, the West Los Angeles Fire Department answered a routine call to douse a burning truck around the corner from their station. But this was no standard vehicle fire. The truck, parked in front of an office building, contained 5 55-gallon barrels and clusters of pipes in its bed, all tilted toward the building. The pipes were improvised mortars designed to lob pipe bombs. Some had already launched. To keep the barrels from rupturing, firefighters used gentle pressure to cool them and extinguish the fire. Bomb technicians were called in. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad rushed to the scene. As they suited up, firefighters explained what they had found. Bomb squad detective Joe Powell realized that a huge catastrophe was narrowly averted.
The fire department described that the drums were cherry red hot because of the fire, and they put the fire out with the water hose that they normally use. The fire department was extremely lucky that the device did not detonate on them when they were putting the fire out.
Powell's primary concern was to be sure there were no secondary devices, so he checked the 5th floor, where windows had been broken by the homemade mortar rounds. The bombs penetrated the office of the IRS, which occupied the 5th floor, but damage was minimal. Then he and his partner cautiously approached the truck. They needed to determine whether the truck was booby-trapped, since their first priority is to keep people from getting hurt.
Once the area was evacuated, we went up and took individual samples out of each drum, analyzed them at the scene visually, and then sent them back to the lab for a scientific evaluation to see what the chemical structure was.
The contents of the barrels were sent to the lab. Using a gas chromatograph, the samples were broken down into their chemical components. The tests determined that the substance inside the barrels was ANFO, an unstable mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The truck contained more than 200 gallons of ANFO. To understand the destructive potential of that much explosive, the LAPD performed a test explosion in the California desert. They filled a pickup truck with a combination of ANFO and TNT to simulate the conditions at the IRS building. The truck had been obliterated. Wreckage littered the desert floor. Nothing recognizable was left behind. In an urban setting, the damage from such an explosion would have been colossal, says FBI Special Agent Nick Boone.
That is almost the equivalent of 1,600 pounds of TNT. This is a high explosive. The blast would have gone out in all directions and done extreme damage for many blocks. The only thing that would have made it more devastating is had this same truck been confined as if in the parking garage, the effect would have been something like Oklahoma City.
In fact, The parking garage was the scene of a potential bombing less than 2 years earlier. In that case, too, disaster was narrowly averted. The IRS building had been the target of bombings before. In September 1988, the basement parking garage was the scene of the first incident. Detective Powell and the bomb squad disarmed a 1971 Toyota at this address. It contained a water heater filled with ANFO. It also had a booby trap under the rear tire. When tripped, the car burst into flames. As the fire department extinguished it, they found pipe bombs in the trunk. Bomb squad technicians determined that gasoline cans and plastic detergent bottles in the back seat were filled with ammonia and bleach. They were designed to fill the garage with poisonous fumes. The bombs were deactivated without incident. The car had been reported stolen from the parking lot of Ford Aerospace, but there the trail grew cold. But not for long. 6 months later, a routine line check by the power company uncovered pipe bombs attached to 4 high-voltage power poles behind the same building. The bombs detonated, causing minor damage. The IRS building in West LA wasn't the bomber's only target. The power line bombs resembled one found 8 months earlier, about 50 miles away. An electronic detonator and ANFO were attached to the base of a power pole servicing the IRS building in Laguna Niguel, California. It was rendered harmless by the bomb squad. It was clear the bombings were related. These attacks and bombings in other buildings dating back to 1986 led to the formation of a multi-agency task force on terrorism. It found that the circuitry in all the bombs was similar. FBI Special Agent Frank Bhakti was a case agent for the task force.
All explosive devices, especially serial bomber explosive devices, have a specific signature or type of construction unique to the bomb maker. And if you could examine a series of unexplained bombings, you can examine the way the bombs are put together and make a fairly educated guess as to whether one person might be responsible based upon the way the bombs are constructed.
Besides the design similarities, all the bombings shared a common target, the Internal Revenue Service.
We began investigating in several directions. One was to try and find other similar bombings that were committed in this area and to see who was either convicted of those bombings or suspected. We also went in the direction of states' rights, anti-government, anti-IRS groups, because they would logically be the kind of people that might attack the buildings and go after IRS.
A potential lead arrived in the mail. In letters sent to the newspaper and to the IRS building, a group calling itself Up the IRS Incorporated claimed responsibility for the truck bombing, as it had the 1988 car bomb attack. Boone considered the letter authentic, as it contained information about the bomb not made public. The envelopes were addressed by hand, giving investigators a writing sample, but they had nothing to compare it against. A more immediately helpful clue was a digital watch used as a timing device. Investigators believed the bomber was trying to show off his high-tech skills, but to no avail. The alarm on the watch used to ignite the truck bomb wasn't set properly, so the device didn't detonate as planned. Even so, the circuitry of the bombs provided the first clear lead. Many components were built exclusively for the military and were unavailable on the street. That suggested the bomber had some contact with the high-tech industry. The fact that the car used in the garage bombing in 1988 was stolen from the parking lot at Ford Aerospace gave LAPD Detective Bob Nelson an avenue to pursue.
We learned later on in the investigation as we went through the components that there were certain identifiable wires and electronic components that were directly attributed to the Ford Aerospace location. However, there was no estimate as to when they were actually utilized. There was no date or any way to tell if it was an old surplus item or something current.
Nelson and Boone were certain the bomber was a past or present employee of Ford Aerospace. But the company employs thousands. The detectives had no way of narrowing the pool. Thanks to the swift action of the West Los Angeles Fire Department, one of the most pivotal clues was preserved. The serial number from the truck used in the 1990 bombing was traced to its last registered owners. Mr. and Mrs. Orozco had sold it for $500 in December of 1989.
Okay. Does it run?
According to Mr. Orozco, the buyer hardly spoke, asked few questions, and seemed anxious to leave. He didn't haggle over the price, and he paid cash. The name he signed on the title form was James T. Harmon. Police knew that if they found Harmon, they'd find the bomber. But what did he look like? A police artist brought an identikit to the Orozcos to create a composite sketch.
Oh yeah, it was.
There was some balding going on.
It contains hundreds of overlays of generic facial features.
The style, straight.
By mixing and matching, the artist slowly fashioned a likeness of the suspect that the witnesses were satisfied with. An initial check with FBI, ATF, and LAPD files came up empty. In the meantime, the bomber struck again. On the morning of March 31st, 1991, mortar fire buffeted the parking lot and roof of the IRS Service Center in Fresno, California. No one was hurt. The 13 missiles were launched from a vacant lot, where investigators collected extension cords, wiring, and crumpled newspaper used as packing. They also picked up a digital watch timing device and aerospace circuitry. Agent Boone knew the same bomber was responsible, and he knew he and Detective Nelson were getting closer to catching him.
I took one look at it, saw many of our components, and knew this is our bomber again. This is our serial bomber. But this time he slipped up, and we got the major break of the case. One of those components was what we call a heat sink. It's simply a piece of metal that disperses heat.
Boone believed the specialized component was probably made by Ford Aerospace. He needed to learn more about it, but everyone at the plant was a potential suspect. Who could he trust? Discreet inquiries about the component brought him nothing. Frustrated, getting nowhere, he showed it to the assembly engineer, taking the chance he wasn't the bomber.
He walked down one corridor, turned the corner, walked down another, reached into a bin, and handed me an identical heat sink. I can't tell you what the feeling was like at that point. It was the most exciting part of the case ever, and I also began to look around quite concerned that I'm now standing here with the heat sink in my hand, and there's every possibility that the bomber is 2 tables away, is on the assembly line, is the engineer around the corner. We got out of there about as fast as we could get away from the assembly line and back off the floor.
Although identifying numbers had been filed off, the components were ringed with red paint. The engineer explained that meant they were defective and pulled off the line. This considerably narrowed down the possible areas at Ford Aerospace.
Only 84 of them were ever manufactured, and 9 of them only had been pulled off the line as defective. So now we really had 4 of 9 in the entire world.
Hello, sir. Thanks for seeing us.
Investigators brought the composite sketch to the manager of the engineering lab, the most likely source of the heat sink. The manager didn't recognize the face and didn't know a James Harmon. Who was this man? Detectives knew they were getting close, but the identity of their bomber still eluded them. How soon before he struck again? How soon before he killed someone? As their search for the bomber continued, Agent Boone and Detective Nelson received a call from the lab manager. After thinking about it, he did in fact recognize the face in the police sketch. It bore a resemblance to an engineer in the large-scale inspection lab. It looked like a man named Dean Harvey Hicks. The investigators raced back to Ford Aerospace. At his desk, they found anti-IRS cartoons, and in his employee file were writing samples that matched the handwriting on the envelopes of the letters that claimed responsibility.
Once we reached a part of the investigation where we were at Ford Aerospace, and Nick Boone pulled open the personnel file and made the comparison with the photograph and the handprinting and handwriting, we knew that Dean Harvey Hicks was our suspect.
Digging deeper, agents learned that on January 17, 1990, a man named James T. Harmon purchased 700 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the main ingredient of ANFO, at the Orange County Farm Supply Company. James T. Harmon was the name on the DMV form submitted after the purchase of the truck used in the 1990 bombing. The handwriting on the receipt matched that of Dean Harvey Hicks. Incriminating handwriting was also found at the scene of the Fresno bombing, placing Hicks at the scene.
He had figured on some newspaper how far his mortar bombs would fire, how much powder would send the bomb how far, and he had worked this out on this piece of newspaper. He then wadded that up and actually used it for packing in the Fresno device. We had that also, when we straightened that out and were able to look at the numbers on a flat surface, we were able to actually also match those to his handwriting.
Agent Boone and Detective Nelson tallied the evidence. Hicks had been off work when each of the bombs was planted. He had access to all of the items linked to Ford Aerospace. He matched the description of the purchaser of the truck used in 1990, and his handwriting matched the letters claiming responsibility. But detectives didn't know if he was acting alone. Before they arrested him, they kept an eye on him.
Surveillance continued while the arrest warrant and search warrants were being prepared, while we looked into his past to determine whether or not there was other people involved with him. At a point in the investigation, we believe that there may be some interest in him constructing another device. We initiated the search warrant and the arrest warrant the following day.
His arrest came on July 11, 1991. Hicks was brought to a hotel room for interview. There, he seemed pleased to provide details about the bombings. He especially liked to answer technical questions the investigators could not figure out.
By the time we had finished the interview, Dean Hicks had made a complete confession and described to us in great detail how he put together and delivered most of the bombs. He actually had some loss of recollection on some of them because it was just too long ago, but he was incredibly detailed on all of the more recent bombings, how he meticulously put them together and how he constructed them and how he delivered them to the site.
While Boone and Nelson interviewed Hicks, forensics experts searched his house and garage. There they found bombs in progress, circuits, ammonium nitrate, and false ID bearing the name of James T. Harmon. The story became very clear. His co-workers at Ford Aerospace knew that Dean Harvey Hicks despised the IRS. But they didn't know he was stealing parts from the workplace in order to attack the government agency. In 1981, Hicks had claimed an $8,500 income tax deduction, a contribution to an organization that the IRS did not consider non-profit. It denied the deduction. Hicks claimed that the IRS employee he spoke with laughed at him, so he used his electronics expertise to exact his revenge. Though he claimed to be part of a group, the Task Force on Terrorism determined that Hicks acted alone.
Organized groups are not always responsible for acts of domestic terrorism. One person can do just as much damage with a little bit of explosive knowledge as an entire terrorist organization. And I think in the past, we would always tend to look at the organized terrorist organizations being responsible for some of the acts. I think Mr. Hicks has shown everyone that one person acting alone can be just as deadly and just as dangerous as a large group.
As clever as Dean Harvey Hicks was, the tireless efforts of investigators like Agent Nick Boone and Detective Bob Nelson finally ended his reign of terror. Finding him guilty on 4 counts of using destructive devices against a federal facility, a jury sentenced Hicks to 20 years in prison. Ironically, he was also ordered to pay more than $335,000 to the Internal Revenue Service. The crimes of Dean Hicks and Roy Moody were personal vendettas disguised as political statements. Like all acts of terrorism, the senseless deeds of these desperate men accomplished nothing. Despite its mystique, terrorism is a crime like any other. And like all crimes, the perpetrator can't help but leave clues behind. With each new case, forensic detectives refine their ability to trace those clues back to the criminal. A bomb blast shatters a residential neighborhood and kills a police officer. What's left are a million scattered fragments and no apparent motive. Authorities hit the streets to solve a murder, but the roots of this insidious crime lie hundreds of miles away. Shops are bursting into flames in Southern California. But it takes investigators years to learn the arsonist's devastating pattern. Some crimes go beyond the scope of local law enforcement and into the realm of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The felon who sets fires, builds bombs, or traffics in weapons isn't just breaking the law. He's committing a federal offense. Located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, lies the quiet working-class neighborhood of Roslindale. But on October 27, 1991, that sense of quiet came to an end. That morning, Thomas Shea Sr. backed his car out of his driveway on his way to work. He heard a scraping noise and stopped to investigate. He found a small black box on his driveway. Though he owned an auto body repair company, Shea knew nothing about the mechanics of cars. He assumed it was part of the undercarriage. His neighbors convinced him it looked more sinister than that. They urged him to call the police. Shea told police about the suspicious object. He was now afraid it might be a bomb. Bomb investigators Jerry Hurley and Frank Foley examined the small wooden box. Each had more than 20 years' experience in high-risk situations. But this time, something went wrong. Hurley and Foley were severely injured by the blast. According to ATF Special Agent Jeff Kerr, the police did what they could until help arrived.
Both of them still conscious, both of them heroic as could be, concerned for each other, asking how is Frank, and Frank asking how is Jerry, and the people in the neighborhood started responding, and ambulances were called, and that was the beginning of quite a long investigation.
Because police officers had been injured in the blast, agents from the ATF's Boston office were called in. The ATF's National Response Team worked with Boston police to find the culprit and the motive. Paramedics tried to stabilize the bomb technicians. Both were seriously injured. They were taken to the nearest hospital. Later that day, Jerry Hurley died of his injuries. Frank Foley was maimed for life. The bomber was now a killer. Investigators collected every speck of debris, hoping some of it might be unique enough to lead to the bomber. Most of the fragments were common electronic components. Toggle switches, soldered joints, electrical tape, batteries. They could be obtained anywhere, making them virtually useless as clues. Among the bits of shattered plastic, metal, and wood, the ATF tried to find a grain of truth. At this point, everyone was a potential suspect, especially Thomas Shea Sr.
First of all, you have to question the validity of the initial statements. Was this thing on the car? Did it fall off? Did this individual who found this actually pick it up, move it, and then a day later move it back? So those are some of the questions. Then why does it detonate when this officer is standing over it? That's one of the questions. Is it designed for a police officer? Was it designed to get a police officer out there and to kill a police officer?
Though the ATF had to consider that Shea might have been the bomber, he wasn't a man without enemies. He'd made a minor career out of petty litigation and was currently involved in a heated lawsuit with the owner of the garage where he rented workspace. The owner was added to the list of suspects.
Get out of my face!
Later, another member of the Shea family appeared on the scene.
Okay, Tommy, why don't you have a seat for me?
Shea's estranged teenage son, Tommy, heard about the bombing on the news. He rushed to his father's house, but when his father's girlfriend wouldn't let him in, he went to the police station to find out what happened. He seemed genuinely concerned. After investigators filled him in, he answered some routine questions and left. The ATF would have to focus their attention on the physical evidence. All of the material collected at the scene was sent to the ATF lab. Investigators found what appeared to be the detonator. Small, white, crystalline particles coated the device. The material was determined to be unexploded dynamite. The technicians reasoned that the explosive had been taken out of its original casing and rewrapped to make it fit inside the bomb. The wrapping also provided the next clue. Bits of colored paper clinging to tape. Forensic chemist Cynthia Wallace examined the paper.
They looked like they were from a magazine. They also had pictures of, looked like mussels and maybe some fruits and vegetables and a little tiny piece of writing. Looking at that, it appeared to me that that might be the graphic artist's name who had designed the photograph and the layout of the article. So I had our librarian give me a list of all the Mussel magazine publishers that she could come up with, and I started calling them up.
Wallace managed to find the magazine that hired that graphic artist. With the publisher's help, she even found the issue and page number of the layout. She asked for a list of local subscribers.
Unfortunately, Mussel magazines like this are usually sold over the counter, and they have very few subscription sales.
Though the quirky wrapping didn't lead directly to the bomber, it helped to establish his signature, the specific way he constructed the device by rewrapping the dynamite. As the evidence collection continued, another clue emerged. Several distinctive screws. They were unique to a specific brand of remote control device. The component is used in remote control toys. Rigging it to an explosive device required some knowledge of electronics. This bomber, whoever he was, had been doing his homework, or had done this before. As investigators began to create a profile of their bomber, the next clue came from an unexpected source. On October 31st, 3 days after the bombing, Tommy Shea held a press conference. The bombing had garnered widespread media attention, and much of it focused on his family. He claimed that he was the target of the bomb. He said the bomber was a man he owed $50,000. Tommy's admission was news to police. Nothing in their investigation pointed to Tommy as the target. After the conference, they asked him to come to the station to tell them more. Agents checked into Tommy's story. They found no evidence that could link the man Tommy accused to the bombing. They also did a background check on Tommy Shea Jr. and discovered he was wanted in another town for receiving stolen property. Police arrested him on the spot and took an inventory of everything he had in his possession. It included a little address book. Eventually, Tommy was released on his own recognizance. By now, police had interviewed 200 people about the bombing and had made very little progress. Investigators turned their attention to the evidence collected from the bomb site. The thousands of tiny pieces recovered from the scene had given the ATF National Response Team enough to reconstruct the device. They passed its description to various police departments. Before long, Special Agent Kerr got his next lead.
One very astute detective remembers a 1986 incident where there was an explosive incident, and he provides that police report and that information to the agents that were down there. They bring it back. There's some similarities to this device, minor similarities, but similarities nevertheless.
In that incident, 5 years earlier, a truck had been damaged by a remote control bomb resembling the one that detonated at Shea's house. The main suspect in the case eventually cooperated with authorities and avoided a prison sentence. His name was Alfred Trinkler.
Somebody said, wouldn't it be weird if that name was in Tommy's book? And went back to the back of it, to the T's, and sure enough, there it was.
Come on in, fellas. What can I do for you today?
On November 6th, a week after the bombing, investigators paid a visit to Trinkler at his home, a short distance from Boston. He had his own small electronics and communications equipment company. He was very cooperative. even sketching for the police the bomb he built in 1986. He denied knowing Tommy Shea and agreed to take a polygraph. Later, he changed his mind about taking the test. Alfred Trinkler certainly seemed like the front-runner on the list of suspects. The problem was that the police had no physical evidence to tie him to the scene. To build their case, or to remove Trinkler from suspicion, the ATF tried a different tack. Investigators of the bombing in Boston knew that the device that killed Officer Hurley resembled the handiwork of Alfred Trinkler. But they didn't know if the fatal bomb was a common design or a unique one.
Good morning, gentlemen.
To find out, they sent the information gathered from the scene to intelligence research specialist Steve Scheid in Washington, D.C. Scheid would be able to plug the information he knew about the device into a national database of bombing incidents.
We were looking for remote control bombs. We were looking for bombs that had magnets attached to them, bombs that had electrical detonators. We were looking for particular types of switches and batteries.
The ATF database sifted through 14,000 bombings and came up with 7 hits. And of those 7, 5 were eliminated because of a clear motive or because they'd been solved. That left only 2, Trinkler's 1986 bomb and the bomb found in Thomas Shea's driveway. No matter what equation they used, the answer was always Alfred Trinkler. Agents believed that Trinkler and Tommy Shea Jr. worked together on the bomb, but investigators had little physical evidence to tie the 2 men together.
Did you listen? No thanks. All right, thank you.
Agents visited electronics stores. In one, a clerk identified Tommy from a photograph. He also found a receipt for merchandise purchased on October 18th, just 10 days before the explosion. It showed electronic components purchased by someone named Ashy, Shea, with the letters rearranged. The store was across the street from a building where Trinkler had been installing a microwave tower.
You all right on that beer, man?
Yeah.
Agents still hadn't clearly identified why Trinkler and Shea would want to kill Tommy's
So
father.
what you need for this?
Shea's friction with his father wasn't a convincing enough motive. Then, agents turned up a better one. Thomas Shea Sr.'s lawsuit against the garage owners. If Shea won his suit, he stood to gain $100,000.
Tommy Shea had made some inquiries to the attorney handling the case for his father, that what happens if my father dies? Where does the lawsuit carry on? And he was informed, yeah, the lawsuit carries on to his heirs, which would be his 4 children.
Days before the bombing, Tommy had also told a friend that he was going to get a large sum of money. A warrant was issued for Tommy Shea and Alfred Trinkler. Though the case against Shea was mostly circumstantial, investigators felt it would hold. Tommy Shea must have thought so too. Shea confessed to buying the bomb components and placing the device under his father's car. He said that Trinkler told him what to buy. Trinkler built the bomb. Alfred Trinkler denied any involvement, even though the evidence was stacked against him. Tommy Shea pled guilty to conspiracy to cause the death of a public servant and abetting the illegal use of explosives. He was sentenced to 12 years. Alfred Trinkler's resolve never weakened. He never talked, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Trinkler and Shea formed a conspiracy of 2, but often a seemingly simple crime can expose a vast network of corruption. In this case, some of the names have been changed. December 9, 1996. Washington, D.C. paramedics responded to the scene of a shooting in the southeast area of the city. They found a young man unconscious, apparently the victim of gang-related violence. His name was Laurent Henderson. On the way to the hospital, Henderson's condition suddenly worsened. The ambulance pulled over. Paramedics worked to stabilize him enough to get to the hospital. An EMT supervisor pulled up and offered to help. The paramedics accepted gratefully. As she worked, a man approached her and demanded to see his cousin. She asked him to step away from the ambulance. He pulled a gun and opened fire. One paramedic struggled with the gunman and wrestled the weapon from him. The other paramedic took a shot to the foot. Henderson was killed instantly. Police processed the scene. The paramedics couldn't identify the assassin. The attack had happened too fast. But he had been injured in the scuffle, and his blood was found on the paramedic's shirt. The garment was kept as potential evidence. The handgun retrieved at the scene, which had delivered the fatal shots, was a .40 caliber Beretta semi-automatic. But Henderson was initially wounded by 9mm slugs. Police knew that 2 guns were used in this crime, but they didn't know if 1 or 2 shooters were involved. Interviews with potential witnesses and people from the neighborhood yielded the tip that cracked the case. A witness told police that only 1 shooter was involved. His name was Robert Byrd. A few days into the investigation, an informant, feeling it was now safe to come forward, told police that on the night of the shooting, she heard Robert Byrd ask a friend to hide a gun in his stepmother's home.
How long have you known Mr. Byrd? Tell me what happened. What?
Police followed up the tip with a search warrant. They talked with Byrd's friend, who denied being involved. Then, they uncovered a 9mm Ruger semi-automatic handgun.
You sure there are no firearms in this house? Found what we're looking for.
The weapon was sent to the police lab. After test firing the weapon, a ballistics comparison determined that this was the gun used to initially wound Laurent Henderson. Robert Byrd was arrested. A warrant was issued for a sample of his blood. DNA testing compared it with the blood found on the shirt. It matched. The odds that the shooter was someone other than Byrd were 1 in 1.5 billion. Byrd was sentenced to 58 years to life for 1 count of first-degree murder and 5 counts of assault. That's where the case might have ended, except that one of the guns used to convict Byrd, the 9mm Ruger, was part of a much bigger story. Washington, D.C. has one of the country's highest rates of handgun violence. Despite strict laws prohibiting handguns, they find their way onto the streets, and most often into the hands of gang members. Over the past 5 years, nearly 2,000 people were murdered in the District of Columbia alone. It's the job of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to stop the flow of these illegal weapons by cutting them off at their source. But once the weapons are already on the street, they could turn up anywhere. The ATF dedicates its vast resources to tracing handguns used to commit crimes, but they have to find them before they can trace them. Records maintained by licensed gun dealers are the key to tracing guns used in crimes. According to the ATF's Washington Field Division Special Agent in charge, Patrick Hines, the records can pinpoint exactly how a gun falls into the wrong hands.
Every gun has a lineage, a pedigree, where it was manufactured, what wholesaler it went to, what retailer, who was the first purchaser of that firearm, and how it weaved its way through the manufacturer to the last person that had it involved in a crime.
Guns are traced by their serial numbers, but many guns retrieved from crimes have had their numbers filed off. Before they can begin a routine trace, ATF forensic scientists have to restore the gun's serial number. That's the job of firearms and tool mark examiner Elizabeth Gillis at the ATF National Lab in Rockville, Maryland. At the lab, they often must raise numbers from 60 or 70 guns at a time. Even if the number appears completely gone, Gillis can usually retrieve it. The stamping process actually changes the molecular structure of the metal, giving it a sort of memory. It just takes a little prodding to restore it. After smoothing and cleaning the surface where the number was filed off, it's treated with a chemical reagent. Because stamping the serial number weakens the metal on the surface of the gun, the reagent attacks the weakened metal around the serial number at a different rate than the metal on the rest of the gun. This reaction, when viewed under a bright light, creates a contrast, making the serial number visible. Once the serial number has been stamped into a gun, it is nearly impossible to obliterate it.
It's almost like indented writing, like if you wrote on a pad of paper and you tore off that first sheet that you had written on, the sheet below, typically you can see an impression of what you wrote on that first page.
With a gun's serial number in hand, ATF investigators can begin to trace it. They first contact its manufacturer. The manufacturer of the gun that killed Laura Henderson reported that it had been purchased by Len Jones, a licensed gun dealer from Missouri. Special Agent Michael Mund found it peculiar that a gun sold in Missouri made its way to the streets of Washington, D.C.
Missouri is not one of the states that we know of being a source state of firearms trafficked in the District of Columbia. About half of the firearms that are recovered in the District of Columbia come from the states of Maryland and Virginia, with the rest of the firearms coming from the southern states.
As a licensed dealer, Jones was required by law to record every gun he purchased and to whom and when he sold it. The ATF found no record of who purchased the gun that killed Laura Henderson. But Jones may have been guilty of more than just bad record keeping. Hoping to find the source of the gun that killed Laura Henderson, the ATF paid a visit to Len Jones. His records indicated that he'd bought 106 handguns. But a check of gun manufacturers determined that between January 1994 and February 96, he had bought more than 1,500 guns. This was a blatant violation of federal gun dealing laws. Investigators wondered how many of these weapons were on the streets of Washington, D.C. It wasn't long before they began to find out. While they were investigating Jones, 4 more crime guns were traced back to him. Most were in the hands of juvenile offenders and were confiscated shortly after he'd sold them. When ATF agents confronted Jones, he came clean. He told investigators that between July 1994 and March 1996, he had sold over 1,000 handguns to a pair of dealers from Tennessee. ATF agents located the dealers, who said they sold the firearms they had bought from Jones at gun shows outside of their home state of Tennessee. The two had run roughshod over firearms laws. Not only is it illegal to sell handguns across state lines, the two didn't even have a license to sell weapons in the first place. They faced up to 10 years in prison. But the two were just one link in the chain of criminals that was delivering guns into the hands of juveniles and other offenders in Washington, D.C. The ATF was willing to work a deal if the dealers would share the names of some of their customers. They told investigators that one of their best customers was a man named Calvin, also from Tennessee. Over the years, they had sold Calvin more than 200 guns. They said that Calvin had bought semi-automatic pistols, mostly 9mm and 38 Rugers and Lorsons. But the two men didn't know where Calvin lived, or even if that was his real name. They told the agents he was an African-American man who drove a station wagon. When they wanted to find him, they called a pager number, which they turned over to the ATF. Agents learned that the pager number belonged to a man named Calvin Brown. They got his address in Nashville, Tennessee. In November 1996, agents began their stakeout.
After a number of hours, we observed the vehicle pull up to the location. A black male was driving the vehicle, and he fit the description that was given to us.
Investigators ran the station wagon's license plate and found out that Calvin Brown's real name was Salon Carroll. He worked as a counselor at a youth center in Nashville.
We felt we were moving along in the investigation and that we needed to bring it to an end so that Carroll could not traffic any more firearms to the District of Columbia.
Investigators devised a sting to catch Carroll, hopefully without gunfire. In December 1996, an ATF informant contacted him to sell some illegal weapons. Carroll specified that he was interested only in guns without serial numbers. On January 15, 1997, they met in a motel parking lot. Carroll purchased 19 pistols and an automatic MAC-10 machine gun for $3,000, with an additional $1,550 to be paid later. When Carroll got out of the car to retrieve the guns, ATF agents moved in. Faced with up to 20 years in federal prison, Carroll admitted to selling over 200 weapons to known gang members in Washington, D.C.
Well, what do you think these kids are doing with those
20 have been taken from juvenile offenders. Crimes committed with these guns include burglary, armed assault, and murder.
It's not going to be all that when you're in.
One of those weapons was sold by Salon Carroll to a gang member in Washington, D.C. The gang member, in turn, sold it to Robert Byrd. Byrd used it to murder Laura Henderson. To date, 109 weapons traced to Carroll have been recovered as the result of joint ATF Washington, D.C. police investigations. Most of the guns illegally purchased by Carroll are still in criminal hands. The ATF continues to monitor the case.
This is only scratching the surface of crime that can develop from this legacy of death and of illegal firearms trafficking. We don't know where these other firearms are going to show up. We only hope that other people do not get hurt or murdered by them.
For some, that hope is already in vain. Len Jones was sentenced to 16 months for illegal sale of firearms. The dealers in Tennessee avoided jail time by cooperating with the ATF. And Salon Carroll was sentenced to 5 years in prison and 3 years of supervised release. At his sentencing, the judge referred to him as the dealer of death. By trafficking illegal weapons hundreds of miles from his home, Salon Carroll distanced himself from his crimes. Other criminals like to work from the inside. January 14, 1987, firefighters in Fresno, California were called to a large fire in a fabric store. It was the beginning of a rash of suspicious blazes. Over the next 4 days, 7 fires were set or attempted in and around Fresno, Tulare, and Bakersfield. All started in shops during business hours. Investigators could not find any evidence of an accelerant, yet all the fires spread quickly. People evacuated from the stores told firefighters the blaze seemed to come out of nowhere. After ruling out other causes, investigators suspected arson in every case. The 7 fires caused over $700,000 in damage. The flames left behind few clues. Arsonists count on fire to destroy all evidence that might lead back to them. Processing fire evidence is a specialized task, one that small-town forensic labs don't usually handle. The samples collected from the fires were sent to the ATF lab near San Francisco.
Daryl, can you take fingerprints of these items?
Among the rubble, the only promising clue was a charred cigarette butt, some burned matches, and a piece of yellow paper secured by a melted rubber band recovered from a fire in Bakersfield. Investigators surmised that these innocent-looking items might have been part of a simple delay device used to set the fire.
Paper.
Investigators were lucky to have found it. ATF senior technician Darrell Classy tried to raise fingerprints from the blackened remains of the incendiary device.
It was a challenge in the fact that the paper was charred, the matches were partially burnt, and the cigarette butt had already been burnt, so that there was very little clear, clean space left to find identifiable latent prints on.
To perform the analysis, Classy soaked a sample of the burned material in a chemical called ninhydrin.
Shake it up so we thoroughly...
The solution reacts with the amino acids present in perspiration residue in a fingerprint. The evidence is bathed in the ninhydrin solution, and if a fingerprint is present, the chemical turns it purple. Tests on the matches and cigarette yielded nothing. Classy was able to raise a single fingerprint from the yellow paper.
Or the clean surface.
Authorities in Bakersfield compared it to the prints of the firefighters who recovered the device to be certain that they hadn't accidentally left the print. It didn't match any of them. The next step was to submit the print to California's automated fingerprint system, which contained the prints of known criminals. Maybe the Bakersfield investigators were dealing with an arsonist with a police record. But their arsonist had no matches, and that meant authorities had no suspects. Until the arsonist struck again and left more clues behind, investigators could do nothing. The case and the clues were filed away and all but forgotten. On March 27, 1991, 4 years after the first fires in Southern California, firefighters in Los Angeles County were called to 3 burning stores in less than 3 hours. Though the blazes were within 2 miles of each other, they occurred in separate fire districts. One of the fires caused $1 million worth of damage. In another of the fires, investigators again found the remains of the same type of delay device made from a cigarette and yellow paper. The suspicious pattern of fires might have gone unnoticed, if not for the LA County Sheriff's Office, which had jurisdiction over the whole area. The sheriff suspected a serial arsonist and notified the ATF. Agents from the ATF went over the records of the various fire departments that had been investigating the suspicious fires. They looked for other fires that fit the same pattern. they found more than they bargained for. Over the past 4 months, 5 fires were set in stores in and around Los Angeles. All fit the same pattern. All started during business hours. No accelerant was found. All were close to each other and to the freeway. On March 31st, 1991, 4 days after the Los Angeles fires, the ATF convened a task force to find other fires in Southern California that fit the pattern. ATF Special Agent Michael Matassa helped to coordinate the effort across jurisdictions as the search for the arsonist began.
Well, at that point, we start interviewing witnesses, employees at these stores, customers at the stores, trying to find out if anything suspicious is known. We start conferring with other investigators to see if they've had similar fires in their jurisdiction.
Investigators in the lab continued to pore over the evidence collected from the fires. Much of the important pieces had been consumed by the blazes. What was left did not yield many useful clues. As part of the outreach effort, an ATF agent was dispatched to the monthly meeting of FIRST, the Fire Investigators Regional Strike Team. He shared the information the task force had gathered and asked the FIRST members if they had anything to add. One of them had much to say.
An investigator from the Bakersfield, Fresno area happened to be in town and was attending the conference. He pulled our investigator aside and turned us on to the possibility of similar fires occurring in the San Joaquin Valley in 1987.
He had been in charge of the 1987 investigation when the ATF Forensic Lab raised the fingerprint from the yellow paper recovered from one of the Bakersfield fires. The investigator looked back at his records. As he compared the fires, he realized that all the suspicious ones had been set around the time of the California Arson Investigators conferences. More than that, he realized that the fires had followed routes from the conferences heading south toward Los Angeles. The implications were chilling. The ATF now had to consider the possibility that the man they were looking for was a fire investigator turned serial arsonist.
Onto a rag. So when she squirted...
As the task force delved deeper into the fires in Southern California, they discovered a series of 5 fires set in Atascadero, San Luis Obispo, and Salinas. They all fit the pattern of the previous fires, and all were set on the same day after an arson investigator conference. As the ATF gathered files from various districts in Southern California, the pattern grew clearer. They discovered that a total of 5 delay-type devices had been recovered from these fires. Each was constructed from cigarettes, matches, and yellow paper. Now that they established a physical link among the fires, ATF agents retrieved the 87 fingerprint from their Fresno office. They submitted it to the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department automated fingerprint system, which accesses state employees as well as criminals. This time, the computer came up with a match, but it was no cause for celebration. Double-checking only confirmed the grim conclusion. The print belonged to arson investigator John Orr. One of California's most respected fire professionals was now the prime suspect in the 1987, 1989, and 1991 fires. A 17-year veteran in the Glendale Fire Department, Orr had earned a statewide reputation as the Sherlock Holmes of fire investigation. He had trained thousands of top fire investigators. That Orr could be responsible for setting dozens of fires over a 4-year period was difficult to believe.
Occasionally you may find as in any other profession, somebody who's gone bad in the field, but to have someone of his reputation and such widespread over such a long period of time, I mean, we're incredulous over it.
They looked for some other explanation. Investigators who had worked with Orr thought that perhaps he had just forgotten to wear gloves when handling evidence. When he was deep in an investigation, he got his hands on everything related to the case. But Orr hadn't worked the 1987 fires. There was no record of him even looking at the evidence. It seemed the only way John Orr's fingerprint could have gotten on the incendiary device was if he had placed it himself. Investigators had to consider him the main suspect. To prove John Orr's innocence or to establish his guilt required a deeper investigation. All they really had was a single fingerprint on only one device.
Well, we kept the investigation very covert because we wanted to make sure that fingerprint wasn't accidentally on the device. We only had him on the one fire, so now it was important for us to keep it quiet while we developed an investigation to tie him into all of these other fires that we were sure the same arsonist had committed.
Investigators checked Orr's log sheets at the Glendale Fire Department to see where he was when the fires were set. The log sheets could give Orr an alibi. If he were logged in at the station, he couldn't have set the fires. But in every instance, they reported him out of the office at an undetermined location.
7825, code 6.
When they followed him, they observed him buying cigarettes. John Orr didn't smoke. Despite this incriminating evidence, building their case wouldn't be easy. Orr knew their business as well as they did.
We knew when it came time to interview him that he had done interviews, so he would know what to expect in the interview. And really, we had to put together as much circumstantial evidence as we possibly could to prove that nobody but him could have done the fires, and that was the tactic we took.
Armed with a photo of their suspect, investigators returned to the scenes of the 1987, 1989, and 1991 fires. They hoped to speak to anyone who might remember seeing Orr. They found several eyewitnesses.
A number of employees were able to pick him out as a customer who had been in the store prior to the fire. In one store, we had an employee say that she saw him carrying some paper in his hand. The yellow paper was part of the device, and she pointed out to us that the color of the paper he was carrying was yellow.
Sure, I'm just looking for some fabric
Witnesses
samples,
put
maybe
Orr
to
at the scene of two of the fires. In both cases, he was spotted in the stores shortly before they burned. Then, the ATF received the forensic report on the devices recovered from the earlier fires. The ATF lab had identified a signature. That is, the devices were all built the same way, using the same materials. The ATF surmised the arsonist didn't need an accelerant because he was placing these devices in flammable items within the stores. The device was designed to start the fire slowly, letting it smolder until the extreme heat erupted into flame. That allowed the arsonist to leave the scene long before the building was engulfed. The construction of the device was simple, but its design pointed to an arsonist with a keen knowledge of fire. The forensic analysis concluded that the devices were the work of a single individual, an individual responsible for more than $18 million worth of damage. The ATF database of arsonists could not match these devices as the signature of any other known arsonist. The report cleared away any remaining doubts investigators might have had about Orr's involvement. Then, Orr himself provided an extraordinary piece of evidence.
I got a phone call from John Orr's supervisor, and he said that he had seen a letter that the secretary was typing talking about a book that John Orr was trying to get published. In that letter, he describes the suspect being a firefighter who's been setting fires for the last 10 years in Southern California and had not been apprehended.
One suspect in this.
Well, you know, but when you
Orr hoped to get the book published and to sell the rights for a television movie of the week.
This is one of Camilo's fires.
ATF agents acquired the manuscript from an author and former firefighter whom Orr had solicited for advice on his novel. For ATF agents who dedicate their lives to investigating deadly fires and bombings, Orr's book wasn't a pleasant read.
Well, frankly, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I mean, I originally thought that maybe it would give us a little insight into John, but never that in my wildest imagination I think that the exact fires we were investigating were going to be chronicled in the manuscript.
ATF agents arrested John Orr on December 4th, 1991. Officers searching his truck found yellow ruled paper, matches, rubber bands, and cigarettes. The same brand used in the devices. In his house, they found videotapes of arson fires still under investigation. They had been shot at close range. The evidence was conclusive, leaving investigators with just one unanswered question.
When we interviewed him, we were concerned with why he did it. I mean, we were convinced that he had done it, and we had good evidence that he did it. And we were trying to get him to explain why, which he never did.
In 1992, John Orr was convicted of setting 3 fires and sentenced to 30 years in prison. In September 1998, Orr was convicted of murder when investigators linked him to a 1984 fire that claimed the lives of 2 store employees, an elderly woman, and her 2-year-old grandson. The jury deadlocked 8-4 in favor of the death penalty. Orr received life plus 20 years. No crime is committed in a vacuum. When an offense involves weapons, explosives, or incendiary devices, solving it depends on finding a pattern. It's the ATF's job to see the big picture and pin down the culprit.